Welcome to Storytime with Scott Boss. Today, we're going to do the last edition of the Graveyard Gazette. It's very exciting. We're going to finish it out today. But I have a special announcement first, is the third book in my Cosmic Arc trilogy is set for release September 8th. So we just learned that, and if you want to catch up on that series, if you haven't read the first two books, they're available on Amazon and all kinds of other ebook places. You can get a paperback or there's an audiobook for the first book, but it's all available online. I link my website in there as well, which has links to that. But otherwise, look up Scott Boss Interstellar Islands to start it out. The third book, like I said, is coming September 8th. For now, we're going to finish off the Graveyard Gazette. Chapter 18. Carrie's alarm pierced the dark, silent room at noon. He swung a hand over to shut it up, then felt Angela's arm tuck around his waist. "Just 5 more minutes," she whispered in his ear. He obliged, taking his time with her as her head tucked into the crook of his neck. "Did you ever think that what would have happened if we would have met under different circumstances?" she asked. "You probably wouldn't have liked me," he said with a chuckle. "I might just not have known I should like you." "What does that even mean?" "That you're a good guy, whether you know it or not. You may not have a crazy career like your sister, or be a local celebrity like Bruce, or even have legs like your ex-wife or the mailman for that matter." Carrie squeezed her and she giggled. "I've heard rumors," Angela said. "Michelle and I talked a bit." "Good Lord." She sat up. "I mean it, though. You're right. I may not have known, but you would have been good for me, no matter how we met." Carrie smiled at the ceiling. "I'm flattered, I guess. I'm not sure what you see. Might just be the exhaustion talking." "Shut up. I'm trying to be sweet." "You are sweet." He kissed her on the forehead. "If things had started different, who knows? I'm not sure where we would have met. An art show, maybe? Not that I go to them. It's not that I don't like art, it's just—" "I know," she patted his chest. "Art shows are boring." "Okay, sorry, I'm not trying to bash it or anything. God knows I could use some art in here." "We can fix that." "So, I should probably get moving here." Carrie flipped back the covers. "Right. The paper just said this evening?" "Yeah, and it looks like I got a text from Michelle a couple hours ago." He held up his phone, squinting at the screen. "We can head by to visit before I drive up to Laura's parents." "Okay, I'd like to see her too." They got ready and drove over to Somerville Hospital. Carrie took a turn into the gift shop and looked through all the colorful crap, bears, cards, and balloons. All of it would make Michelle gag. Then he saw it, a gray blob-shaped plush with 2 flippers holding a heart that said love. The sign in front of it read, "Mitch the Manatee." Carrie grabbed it off the shelf. He set it in front of an old woman at the register and smiled. "Just this, and do you possibly have a Sharpie I could buy or borrow? My friend has a cast I need to sign." The lady gave him a big smile and rooted through her drawer, sliding a black Sharpie across the counter. "As long as you promise to bring it back. I lose more of these than I can count." "I promise," said Carrie. "Thanks." The lady rang up the manatee. "That'll be $15.75. Carrie reached for his wallet for some cash. Looks like I'm out. You take card?" She pointed him to the reader and he paid, thanked her again for the marker, and they were on their way to room 305. Carrie stopped at the elevator and instructed Angela to hold the manatee. He pulled out the Sharpie and wrote "hate" just below the word love on the manatee's heart. Angela smiled. Oddly, I think she's going to love that. Michelle was watching a horrible afternoon courtroom show with Honorable Judge Lawson when they walked in. She grabbed the remote and turned it off. "I don't even think he was a real judge," Michelle said. Carrie thrust the manatee at her and she grabbed it, looking it over for a second. "Mitch? You son of a bitch, Carrie." He smiled. "It's like it was made for you." "I do enjoy the doctored heart, though." She set Mitch on her tray next to a styrofoam cup of water. "Thanks." There was a vase on the bedside table with bright sunflowers and a mix of various greens pouring out of it. "Nice." Angela felt some of the leaves between her fingers. "Would you believe it was from Johnny?" said Michelle. Carrie smiled. "That dude's got a soft spot for you. Always has, whether he'll admit it or not." "I guess so. Thankfully, they got my left arm, so I can keep my arm wrestling title if I need to." Yeah, how is it? Asked Angela. Michelle raised her casted arm slowly. Doctor says I should mostly keep my range of motion. He had to repair the tendons, but within 3 to 6 months I should be back to normal. Angela put a hand on her side of the bed. God, I'm sorry. Hey, could have been my heart if she hit. If you hadn't been there. Look, let's not talk about it. We're all alive, right? Carrie and Angela exchanged glances. What? Asked Michelle. What's the look? Johnny didn't tell you, said Carrie. Tell me what? She looked at the flowers. Oh, these were delivered. He said he'd be by later. Carrie took her Carrie told her the story of the rest of their night, Cleve, the building, and the most recent issue of the Graveyard Gazette. Shit. Michelle took a drink of her water, replacing it, then holding Mitch to squeeze. When I thought I'd heard it all, it turns out it was only the beginning, huh? Maybe I got off easy. I wouldn't call it easy, said Angela. I think your loved ones already, you know. Michelle nodded. I guess so. So it sounds like you guys have already made your peace with it then. You could say that, said Carrie. You had it out now? Michelle looked up at the clock. Yeah. Well, bring it in then. She raised her good arm. Just be careful with me. Carrie leaned in and hugged her. It was the first time he could remember doing so. No matter where she, or him, or Bruce, or Johnny for that matter, ended up in life, they'd always be bonded by the past week. Possibly more than he ever was with anyone. Angela and Michelle hugged as well, then Carrie pulled out the Sharpie. Can I? Michelle laughed and nodded. Go easy, though. Damn thing is tender. It's like I got shot or something. He and Angela signed it, his with the chicken scratches resembling a doctor's prescription pad, and hers with the beautiful stroke of an artist. They said their goodbyes and headed back to the main lobby. Carrie was almost out the door when he glanced back at the gift shop. Oh, shit, I better drop this off. He jogged the pen into the shop, then met Angela back at the entrance. He walked her to her car, and she hugged him. It felt like she was fighting back tears as they stood by her Honda. You okay? Carrie asked, not letting go. Yeah, it's been an eventful couple weeks for me. Carrie looked at the clothes hanging in her car and wondered what she really meant. You should go, she pulled away, but first kissed him on the lips, holding his face as she did, then let go before he had a chance to really kiss her back. Okay, he kept his eyes on her. I'll call you when it's over? Yeah, I think I'm gonna call my mom. Carrie smiled, held her held on to her hand for a few seconds, raised it for a kiss, then walked away. Chapter 19. Carrie was on the highway 105, fidgeting with his phone, trying to decide what he was going to tell Laura's parents. He was in town to ski? Or visit an outdoors store? They wouldn't believe that. What about a new brewery? More believable, but not for an hour and a half drive. He came up with something and hit the number. Hello? Said a voice that had to be Laura's mom. Beth, said Carrie. This is Carrie. How are you? Oh, Carrie, it's been a while. She took a deep breath, something she did when she had more to say, so Carrie let her. You know, we saw you on the news the other night. Well, Laura pulled it up on her computer. That was brave what you did. He smiled as he drove. Good start so far. Thanks. I was just doing what anyone would have done. Oh, don't sell yourself short. There was a rustling in the background. Hold on, let me switch you to the cordless. Laura's parents, the Vinoys, never gave up on their landlines. Her dad used a cell phone, but her mom only carried one for emergencies, and forgot to bring it with her half the time. The cordless was the phone they kept in the living room, meaning she was probably in the kitchen with her little TV tuned to Dr. Phil or Dr. Oz, or some other TV doctor Carrie hadn't heard of yet, and was likely making some edible creation for her husband when he came home. The line rustled a bit more, then she was back on. That's better. Are you there? Yeah, I'm still here. I was just calling because I'm going to be in town soon. I'm meeting up with some old friends for dinner. I thought if you weren't too busy, we could catch up. Oh, how nice, said Beth. Carrie had always had a good rapport with her, despite Laura's dad, Gary, hounding him about his career every time they visited for a holiday. When will you be in? Probably about 4. I know it's kind of last minute. I just thought, of course, we'd love to catch up. I'm afraid Gary's working late, but Laura should be home around 5. The name felt like a cold cup of water in his chest. She will? Yeah, that would be nice. Beth laughed. Well, I'm sure you weren't just calling to check in with me now, were you? Carrie laughed as well. Guilty as charged, though I really do just want to say hi. I'm not trying to make a scene. Well, I hope not. She paused for a second. Oh, you'll be here in no time. I better put on a pot of coffee. Carrie pulled into his former in-laws' driveway, not sure where to park, fearing Laura would come home and see his car, even though that was the whole point of his visit, to see her. The Vinoys lived in a beautiful wooded neighborhood with large houses spread out by acre lots. There was a tree-covered entrance that led to their two-story red brick house. He parked on the side of the two-stall garage next to a trailer covered in a tarp. When he got out, the cool air and smell of pines brought him back to many Christmas visits over the years. One in particular came to the front of his mind. Laura was turning 30 in a few months, and being without child was weighing on her more than he knew at the time. He should have seen it, but he just viewed it as they tried and it didn't happen. In retrospect, she probably resented him for that for years. Maybe she still did for all he knew. They argued in the car. Her showing up for Christmas, not pregnant yet again, was really bothering her. She didn't want to face her mother's wishful face. Any special announcements? Beth would ask. It was her motherly way of asking without straight up asking, but it was like a slap in the face to Laura, or a slap in the uterus. Carrie remembered pulling in front of one of the garage stalls and Laura jumping out before he'd cut off the engine. She had her pillow tucked under one arm and her purse under the other as she stormed to the door and went up to the guest room they stayed in for visits. Carrie tried to play it off that she was just tired from the drive as he dragged in their bags, but Beth seemed to know what it was about. Maybe they'd had a conversation on the phone a few days prior that he was not privy to. Laura put on a good face for the family that night, but when they got to their room, after brushing their teeth in silence, he could hear her sniffing from her side of the bed. He put an arm on her shoulder and was relieved when she met it with her hand. "What if I'm just barren?" she asked. "Maybe I am." "Shouldn't we find out?" "If you want to." "Don't you think so too?" "I guess." Carrie was apprehensive about having children and felt like this let him off the hook, only Laura was saying otherwise. "Do we have the money in savings?" she asked. "I mean, the initial testing might not be much, but then in vitro and all that." "I don't know. We'd have to check." They laid in silence for a few minutes, Carrie thinking the discussion was over. Then he had a stupid thought and said it aloud. "I love you, Laura. Isn't that enough?" He could feel the goosebumps well up on her arm. "Well, yes, but never mind. Let's just go to sleep." Carrie closed his car door and began to walk out to the front door. It was weird visiting without Laura. It was weirder knowing she soon would come home and die there, and the only option he had was to kill himself in her place, to be the replacement, if that was even how it worked. Before he could ring the bell, the door swung open. Beth was standing in a holiday sweater featuring cardinals perched on a Christmas tree. Her gray hair had streaks of blonde in it last time he saw her, but now she was full silver. "Carrie!" She reached out her arms and he went in for a hug. "So nice, out of the blue just like this. Come in." She waved him on. "The place hasn't changed much outside the tile in the kitchen. Gary did it a few months ago." Carrie stepped in and she closed the door behind him, taking his coat and hanging it on an oak coat rack. "You finally got him to tile it, huh?" Carrie looked towards the kitchen. "With enough nagging, anything can be accomplished." She laughed at her own joke. "I should put that on one of those inspirational pictures or coffee mugs or something." She waved him to follow her. "Come on, let me show you." They went to the kitchen and he mustered up all the enthusiasm he could over flooring. It was a nice charcoal pattern, and though it was necessary, the small talk was killing him. "Gotta clean the grout now, don't you?" She shook her head and poured 2 cups of coffee. "Just no dirty shoes in the kitchen. That's the rule." Carrie looked down instinctively at his own shoes, hoping he hadn't picked up any mud on the way in. Beth slid him a cup. "2 sugars, 1 cream." Carrie took a sip. He remembered. She clicked her tongue. "It hasn't been that long. Now come back to the living room. Tell me what you've been up to." Carrie swallowed hard. What had he been up to? It was a good question he really didn't want to answer. He wanted to be out of there before it happened. Or did he? Leaving this poor, sweet woman to watch her daughter die? He wasn't sure he had that in him. He picked a brown leather recliner as Beth settled into the couch, clicking at a remote to turn down the volume on some celebrity chef mixing goat cheese, basil, and sun-dried tomato, topping it off on a perfectly prepared steak. Carrie felt his stomach rumble and remembered he'd skipped lunch. "So, tell me about the thing," said Beth. The rescue." "The kids?" Carrie didn't want to relive that story anymore. Not now that things had turned out how they had. It didn't feel like an accomplishment as much as a horrible mistake. But he did his best for Beth, leaving out the details of how they saved 9. 5 had died, but it would have been 12 if he and his group hadn't showed up. "That's just so amazing," said Beth. "Terrible for the ones that didn't make it, but amazing at the same time." "I guess so." He sipped on his coffee some more, knowing he had to ask her. "Did you happen to tell Laura I was here? Or going to be here when she gets home?" "Oh," she waved a hand at him. "Let it be a surprise. I'm sure she'll be happy to see you." Carrie's heart sank. He wasn't so sure about her conclusion. "Don't you think she should have a little warning?" Beth set down her coffee, flipped off the TV, and Carrie knew she was about to get real. "Listen, Carrie. I know you've had your differences. I know you weren't perfect, but neither was she, and I think she realizes that now." Carrie tilted his head. "What does that mean?" "She's been with us for most of this year. I've seen her. She thinks she's happy at this job she has at the fitness club, but it's no life for her, not without you." "Without me," said Carrie. "She'd divorce me, Beth. If she misses me, if she wanted me back, she could have told me that at any time." "She was afraid. Afraid you'd both fall back into that life in Bremerton. You hating your job and her resenting you for it." Carrie felt that one hit home. He took a drink of coffee just so he could think before replying. "She sent me my old sweater. Barely anything but 'here you go.' She's changed her phone number and hasn't told it to me. I think she's moved on from me." Beth's eyes stayed kind and encouraging. "She just doesn't want to go back there, to Bremerton. That's all, Carrie. Now listen, Gary and I were talking the other day. After watching you on the news, you're a natural leader, a good guy. You're wasting yourself down there. Gary's company just took on a new property. They're turning it into offices. They'll need a lot of things, security, maintenance, you name it. He could get you a job in no time. Benefits, 401k. You two could have the guest room until you get settled. We wouldn't even know you were up there." Carrie's breathing was rapid. 6 months ago he would have dreamed of this, jumped at the chance. Not his father-in-law throwing him a bone, but the chance to get out of Glax Corp, just to get the hell out of Bremerton. Most of all, to be with Laura again. Hell, 2 weeks ago he would have taken this offer, but now? Beth didn't know what was coming. His heart broke for her over and over again, knowing one way or another this dream of hers was not coming true. "I don't think," Carrie started. "You just think about it, Carrie. You coming up to here today was not an accident. It was divine." Carrie was trying not to entertain her proposition, but he couldn't help it. In an alternate reality, there'd be nothing to think about. What was a maintenance job compared to Glaxcorp? He could use something new, fresh, even if it was that, or he could have, 2 weeks ago. He had to remind himself of the picture in the paper he saw about 12 hours prior. "But Laura," he said, "she told me she's happy, that she's good without me." "Well, she's not." Beth's voice was firm, then she whispered, "I'm a terrible sneak. Even in my 60s. I was changing her sheets in her room while she was out at work, and I found her journal. Now, I'm not going to show it to you, that would just be wrong. But I did take a peek myself, and I can say for sure she misses you. She's just afraid you'll never leave Bremerton, and she has too many ill memories down there. She's happy up here, yes, but she'd be truly happy if you were here too." Carrie remembered her journal obsession. There was another long selection process she had him take part in at Barnes and Noble. He honestly didn't know she even used the things, but it was possible she wrote while he was at work. He wasn't sneaky like Beth, or maybe he would have seen the divorce coming a bit better. Now his head was spinning. Why couldn't he have taken an impromptu trip up here a couple weeks ago? Why couldn't his made-up friends have invited him for dinner then? What about Angela? It didn't matter now, because time was running out. He'd read the paper, played God, and someone had to die for that. Only, now he was going to do everything in his power to make sure that it wasn't Laura, but him. Maybe he couldn't stay and make her truly happy, but he could at least let her try without him. Carrie downplayed the invite to move up to Boone to be with Laura again. He reaffirmed the purpose of his visit was solely to catch up and then he'd be on his way. Beth mostly left it alone from there, and they waited for Laura to get home. She did remind him that he might change his mind, but she still didn't know all that was in his mind. The moment came. They heard a car outside. It was a painstaking couple minutes as they waited for her. He resisted the urge to stand up and to the blinds peeping out. Finally, he heard footsteps up the sidewalk and decided to stand up to greet her, afraid to be plopped down in her dad's chair like it hadn't been almost a year. The door opened and she looked at him with a tilted head. Carrie? I thought I saw your car outside. What are you doing here? Carrie was at a loss for words for a few seconds. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a ponytail. She looked like she'd been sweating like someone who worked at a fitness club all day. But the workout leggings and slim jacket showed her figure in a way he'd only seen in his dreams lately. He forced a few choked words out of his throat. I was just in town, meeting up with some friends later. Oh, really? Which ones? Her damn questions, and knowing pretty much all of his friends since he was 20. Just a couple guys from the factory. They're going skiing this weekend. I'm just meeting up for the food part. He knew it was a shitty cover story, but hoped she'd buy it. Laura set her purse down and hung up her coat, eyeing him as she was known to do when dissecting his words. She moved on to her as she took off her shoes. So, you guys just having coffee? Yeah, said Beth. Just talking. Carrie didn't like the inflection in her voice. How was your day? Laura cocked a hip. Oh, sold some protein shakes, handed out some towels. I did have a client today, but she needed some major pushing. I had to. She stopped mid-sentence and seemed to realize that it was not a year ago, and Carrie was now an intruder. Well, She ran a hand over her hair nervously. Good, good, said Beth. You want some coffee? Actually, yeah. Laura walked into the kitchen, poured a cup, and collected her thoughts. When she came back out, she looked confused as Carrie and Beth still stood watching her. Is there somebody else here? Huh? Said Beth. No, it's just us. Your father's working late. Why? What was that other car behind Dad's trailer? That's Carrie, silly. No, Mom. Laura shook her head, annoyed. I saw Carrie's car. There's another car. What? Said Carrie, knowing there hadn't been another car when he pulled in. He looked around wildly. The cause of death hadn't been in the paper, but there had to be a cause, didn't there? His stomach turned into a knot. You need to hide. Chapter 20. Carrie had Laura's wrist in his hand, yanking her to the staircase. She spilled her coffee on her arm and yelled, Carrie, what the hell's going on? Beth was just behind them, confused but following. Just get upstairs. He gave her one last tug, propelling her to the stairs, then grabbed Beth's shoulders as she caught up. Are the back doors locked? The fear was in her eyes and she could barely focus on him. Not usually during the day. I don't remember if... She was cut off when they heard the weather stripping squeak on the opening of a door in the kitchen. Just go, Carrie sent Beth up the stairs after Laura. Laura stopped at the top. Carrie? Her face was full of terror and confusion. Carrie looked at her, knowing it would be the last time. Taking it in, her, their life, the future they might have had. It wasn't fear that washed over him then, but disappointment. That it had to end like this. Someone is trying to kill you, and I'm not going to let them. Her eyes widened with horror. She was frozen in place until Beth ran into her like a linebacker, sending them both down the hall and spilling the coffee she still held on to. Carrie could hear their cries from the hot coffee, but they were out of sight. He looked back to the kitchen entry. His view was from an angle, unable to see much beyond the frame. Johnny's words came flooding into his head. What if it's an axe murder or a gunman or something? Carrie saw their fireplace about 10 feet across the room. If he could make it there, grab one of the steel pokers. But why? The whole point was to offer himself as the sacrifice in her place, a true deal with the devil as he saw it. But what guaranteed the killer would stop with him? What if it was just an appetizer and then the shadow wanted to make up a few more of the lives it missed out on during the school bus rescue? He didn't have time to think as he saw the entry to the kitchen darken. Angela? Said Carrie. A few minutes prior, Angela sat in her car, holding her phone to her ear, trying to catch her breath and make it even when she heard Laura's car pull up. She ducked down onto a pile of old bills in her passenger seat. She heard her mom pick up the phone with a suspicious voice saying, "Hello, who is this?" When Laura went up to the walk to the door, Angela replied, "It's me, Mom." "Angela? It's been a while. How are you? How's Maya? I need your new address so I can send you two a Christmas card. Can you—" "Mom, just stop." There was a brief pause. "What is it? Are you okay?" "You chose David over me. I'll never forgive you for that, but I'm ready to move on." "Now, honey, I love you, Mom." "Well, I love you too. You know I always have." "I can't believe you're still trying to blame David for—" Angela was ignoring the speech. She knew it would come if she mentioned David. She took some deep breaths, sat upright in the driver's seat again. "Mom, listen to me." The other end of the line went silent. Angela continued, "Be careful tonight." "Now, what does that mean? You're not— And tell David to go fuck himself." She hung up the call before her mom could reply, then dialed one more number, put it on speaker, and dropped the phone in the seat next to her. Voicemail picked up immediately. "This is Maya. Leave a message if you want." Angela rested her head on the steering wheel as tears rolled down her cheeks. Carrie stared at her in disbelief. Angela stood shaking in the kitchen entry, holding the wall for support. "What are you—" asked Carrie. "How did you get here?" Neither of them closed the gap. She looked at him with fearful eyes while her shallow breathing made it sound like she was hyperventilating. "Just hear me out," said Angela. "I knew you were coming up here, so I found the address in that book you keep on the bedside stand." "The fuck, when I was sleeping?" She nodded. "Yes, I'm not going to let you do this." "Angela," Carrie realized he'd only come to the conclusion in the last hour that he was going to stand in for Laura. Had Angela seen it in his eyes before he left? Before even he knew? "Listen, what we had was special, but I've got to do this. It's not Laura's fault." She cut him off. "It's not about us. It's about you and her. Together or separate, you both deserve another chance." Carrie realized she wasn't trying to save him for herself. She was trying to— His thoughts were interrupted by screaming from upstairs. Angela and Carrie exchanged a glance as they bolted towards the staircase. When they reached the top, the screaming had stopped. Carrie slammed open Gary's office door but saw nothing, then peered into the guest room he and Laura shared over the years. Still nothing. The master bedroom was closed and the knob wouldn't budge in Carrie's hand. He slammed on the door with an open palm. "It's Carrie! Let me in!" There was no reply. He backed up and mimicked Officer Hargrove's motion from the Purple House in Riverwind. His shoe collided with the wood just below the knob. It took 2 tries and then the door swung open. He and Angela rushed into the room to see Laura and Beth huddled together on the right side against a window, smashing the curtains into the blinds as they tried to get as far as they could from something. A king-size bed sat in the middle, perfectly made, with a small safe flipped on its back on top of the comforter. Against the left wall was a figure that had been giving Michelle nightmares any time she dozed off in the hospital. Angela and Carrie finally saw what she had seen the night little Sophie shot her mother and herself. The shadow formed the shape of a person with holes for eyes. They glowed a pale blue on the wall, despite the earth tones Beth chose when they painted the room. The eyes left Laura and Beth and shifted, along with a tilt of the black head, towards Carrie and Angela. Angela held up both hands towards it. "Please, we're the ones that did it, not them. We didn't know what we were doing. We talked to Cleve, and I want to be the replacement for Laura, please." The shadow tilted from side to side, the blue eyes sliding along the wall as it did, dipping down in the middle, then back up, as if it were swaying to music while making a decision. Carrie grabbed Angela's shoulders. "What are you doing?" She didn't take her eyes off the wall and spoke in a determined grunt. "Just let me do something good, for once." She pushed him away, then approached the wall, her own shadow landing next to the giant one. "We won't mess with the paper any more," Angela continued, looking at the glowing eyes as their shape narrowed to a squint, listening to her words. "All of us, we're done. I'll be your payback. Just leave them out of it." She motioned behind her. "Mom," said Laura. The word, barely audible to Carrie and Angela, took no notice as Beth moved to the bed. There were 5 quiet beeps, then a click. "Mom, what are you doing?" Laura stuck a hand out but didn't dare move. Beth stood at the edge of the bed, pointing a handgun at the wall. Her shadow appeared on the other side of the giant. It looked like it was surrounded by children. Beth's hands were shaking. Laura was almost to her side when she fired. The room exploded with noise and the smell of smoke. Carrie was relieved to see Angela still standing in a hole in the wall directly between the blue eyes of the shadow. Laura had her hand on Beth's shoulders as her eyes were wide, not leaving the wall, with her lips pulled back into a horrified frown. Light shone just below the eyes of the shadow as it opened into an evil smile. Black hands emerged from its side, dangling fingers over Angela's shadow and Beth's, almost as if it was deciding which piece of candy to pick from a Halloween bowl. After what felt like an eternity for the four humans, locked in place, Angela close to the wall, Carrie a few steps behind her, Beth holding the gun by the bedside, and Laura next to her, the shadow made its decision. The right hand tucked back into the main body, and the fingers, which Carrie couldn't even count, only moved above Beth's shadow. Then they stopped wiggling and shot out like tentacles of an octopus wrapping around her head. Laura screamed and looked at Beth's head, hoping to pull them off of her, but there was nothing there, only on the wall. She tried to embrace her mother, but it was like hugging cold stone or dry ice. Laura let go, feeling the burn on her skin. Then Beth's gun shifted from the eyes on the wall, sliding to her left. Angela's arms were in the air, as if worshipping the shadow. Beth took aim. Laura screamed. Carrie called out, "No!" and the gun went off. Angela dropped to the floor. Nobody noticed how much the room brightened after that. By the time Angela landed, it was as if someone flipped on the light switch. Carrie was at her side within seconds, holding her hand and giving brief glances to see the shadow was gone. Beth tossed the gun on the bed like it was on fire, breaking into tears as Laura was now able to embrace her. The shadow was satiated. Chapter 20. Gary Vinoy arrived home, after receiving a call from Laura, to find multiple police cruisers in his yard, along with a few other cars that hadn't been there when he left that morning. His former son-in-law was in a heated discussion with one of the officers near his cruiser. They exchanged an insane glance that meant they would have to do a lot of catching up when the time came. Gary hurried in to find Beth on the couch. Laura, with her arm around her, and the stairs to his bedroom blocked off with a guy in a black coat holding a clipboard. Beth stood up and hugged him, breaking back into tears and mumbling something about the shadow. After they each gave a statement and Angela's body was removed from the house, Carrie and Gary stood in the driveway, watching the last car pull away. Gary turned to him and pulled out his hand. "I don't know what the hell happened here. All I know is Laura and Beth say they'd be dead if you didn't show up. I don't know how to thank you for that." Carrie shook his hand, unable to form an appropriate reply. "They also told me that you'd give me the real story when the fuzz was out of our hair." He raised an eyebrow at Carrie. "How about that?" "Let's talk inside," said Carrie. After the shadow departed, and before the police arrived, Carrie held a firm coaching session with Laura and Beth, explaining that if they went into details about a shadow monster causing her to shoot Angela, Beth would be hauled off and put either in prison or a mental hospital. He promised he'd explain as much as he could when it was over. Thankfully, they'd gone with his story. The police came to the conclusion that Angela was a woman down on her luck, looking for valuables to pawn. She was listed as a former teacher at Madison Middle who'd stopped coming to work after the death of her daughter about a month back. Carrie wanted to defend her, to say she was a poor woman who never got a fair shot in life, but that she had a great heart, a beautiful smile, and a good sense of humor. But he had to stick with the story that they agreed upon, that he didn't catch a good view of her until she'd been shot in the head. He wasn't sure if they'd put together that he and Angela were part of the group that saved the kids on the bus, and that somehow here they were again, together, 2 hours away from where the bus crashed, at his ex-in-law's house. Time would tell. They sat down in the living room, Gary, Beth, and Laura on the couch, and Carrie in the chair. He was ready to tell his story, not sure if they'd believe him or what acceptance or rejection of it meant going forward, only that it would feel good to get it out. Epilogue. It was past midnight when Carrie arrived home, back in Bremerton. Despite the Vinoy family's pleading for him to stay, he drove back after finishing his story. He needed a quiet place to think and knew he wouldn't be able to clear his head under the same roof as Laura that night. The first thing he'd noticed was his deadbolt wasn't locked, but the knob was. He remembered locking both when they left for the hospital to see Michelle, but he needed a key for the deadbolt. Carrie flipped on the light and looked around for any signs of intrusion. When he saw it, a painting over 4 feet tall leaned up against his couch facing him. There were dark blues and grays around the swirling squids. The title at the bottom read, The Depths. It was signed Angela Moretti. 3 weeks later, Carrie shut down his machine at GlaxCorp and dropped his safety goggles and gloves straight into the trash. He was coming down from a sugar buzz from the cake they'd had during break as he walked up to Johnny's station. Bruce was there with him. "Can't believe it," said Johnny. "I always thought I'd find you dead, sucked up in one of the conveyor belts someday." Bruce stepped in front of him. "I think he means to say we'll miss you." He put a hand out and Carrie met it. "I'll miss you guys too," said Carrie. "I already told her, but give my best to Michelle when she gets back." "Will do." Johnny held up a hand in a final wave, and Carrie walked out of GlaxCorp for the last time. And that's the end of the Graveyard Gazette. Thank you so much for listening to every part. I know it's been a lot of weeks of getting pieces after piece. If you waited till the end to listen to all of them, good for you too, for patience. And thanks for listening if you listen every week. One more reminder, my third book in the Cosmic Arc Trilogy is going to be out this September 8th. It will be available. Go check out the first 2 on Amazon. Look for Scott Boss, Interstellar Islands, to get it started. Otherwise, see you back for another story time with Scott Boss sometime in the future. Bye.